back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this interview, I had the opportunity to interview Ron Shultis, a longtime friend and somebody who has quite a lot of experience working in the government. We kind of meander around in this episode, and we do talk a bunch about different ideas related to corporate propaganda. But I think one of the things that stands out to me from this conversation the most is this idea that a lot of this stuff is kind of gray and nebulous. What constitutes free speech? What constitutes propaganda? What constitutes rational discourse? And even if we can identify all of those things, where's the line when we call for governments to restrict? Or where is the line in regard to what's moral? Sometimes there's this policy of just, well, you know it when you see it. You just know that something's wrong when you see it. But that's really subjective and doesn't sit too well with most of us. But I think that's good to understand, and I think that's good to kind of wrestle through this idea that things aren't always so black and white, and there's a lot of difficulty in assessing these things and a lot of humility that we should have when we come to these conversations. I also think this episode is important because a lot of the tone of the previous episodes in this section might have given you the impression that maybe I leaned a little bit more towards being anti-capitalistic or anti-free market or whatever you want to call it. And in this conversation with Ron, we get to kind of hash that out, especially at the end, where I discuss how there are really flaws to every system. And, the accrual of wealth and capital, while not an inherently bad thing to get wealth, is really problematic because we know how people use power and abuse power. And money is power, right? Most of our conversation is us talking about how politicians are influenced by money. It's just how it works. That's what builds relationships, and that's what is going to fuel legislation, right? So that's a problem, I think, fairly clearly. But at the same time, other systems have their own inherent problems, and they just accrue power slightly differently. But they wield it the same. They wield it and end up harming others, especially those who are kind of on the margins. So this episode is good because Ron comes from more of a free market standpoint, and so we get to talk about maybe corporate propaganda, but then kind of round that out by discussing some of the pros and kind of what Ron is going for, especially as a Christian. And I think that's where our episode on the false prophet and how Christianity has dealt with wealth comes in. Wealth and freedom are good things, right? Plenty is a good thing. Having what you need is a good thing. But as a Christian, while I want to enable others to have freedom, God's call to me personally and to anyone who calls themselves a Christian is to really reflect on what he's given to us and figure out, what do we do with that? How do we live generously in love, helping the people on the margins rather than creating legislation that's going to wall up my wealth and protect me and my family while harming others, right, at the expense of others. So this is a good episode to kind of balance out this section of the season and to just get a good finishing look at propaganda in the corporate world. So here it is, the interview with Ron Shultis. So I'm not sure how much of a background I've given to you about wanting to talk to you for this episode in particular, but I've been doing a lot of studying on propaganda.
Okay.
And so as I'm looking at propaganda, I looked at a lot of different areas, propaganda and abuse, how abusers use propaganda to manipulate their victims and how they cover it up, and propaganda in politics, propaganda in with corporations, all kinds of things. So when I got to the corporation aspect, I was trying to figure out who can I talk to that might have some insight into how this all kind of intermingles. And so I thought of you, and I thought of you because there are a lot of overlapping areas that I think you have. So you value corporations and free market business, right? You have experience pushing back against the corporate overreach at the same time through politics, and you've told me a number of ways that you can't stand how corporations kind of are intermingled with government. Right. And at the same time, you're also a Christian who values justice, who values mercy, generosity, and all of those things. And I know that a lot of people's heads probably explode when they think of all of those three things kind of coming together, because some of them, I think, in our culture seem like they just can't go. Right. But I feel like you try to embody those three values. Do you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, maybe it's a walking contradiction, but no, I think you're right. I mean, I think for me, it's obviously Christian faith is number one, first and foremost, obviously, but then how that plays out in a non-religious, let's just say human interaction, societal sphere. You know, I think the best way to live a lot of our Christian faith and values is through free market economics and individual liberty. And so I try to embody those and fight from it from that perspective. And so, you know, it's part of one of the reasons why I do what I do and where I work and you know, why I've kind of made that my mission, I guess, is to remove government barriers so that way people can flourish in whatever way that makes most sense to them, right? And so I think you hit it pretty well.
Okay. Well, before I start grilling you with all the questions, maybe you could just briefly introduce who you are and kind of some of your background that might be pertinent for the discussion.
Sure. So my name is Ron Shultis. We've known each other for many, many years now. I guess in terms of a pertinent background for this discussion, always been interested in politics and policy. Kind of figured that's what I wanted to do with my life. The reasons why I changed over time, you know, obviously just hit on that a little bit. But in terms of background, kind of cut my teeth right at the end of college and right out of college, worked in the Georgia legislature as a legislative aide for a bit. And then moved to Chicago, spent some time in the private sector while my wife was in grad school. That's kind of when I did a lot of my ideological reading and kind of working through issues in that time. And then 5.5 years ago now, started working for a free market think tank. We focus solely on the state of Tennessee. That's where I live and is in Tennessee. For my think tank, I'm our director of policy and research. And so I do a lot of economics research, policy writing. And so I lead all of our in-house research efforts. I've published many research studies, been interviewed quite a few times, mostly state, a little bit of had some articles placed nationally, TV from time to time, things like that. And part of that, I know we want to get into a little bit about this, also registered lobbyist. And so help to try and get some of the reforms that my organization researches and cross the political finish line and enact it into law through the political process. So that's a little bit of a background about, I guess, who I am and what I do. So.
All right, perfect. So I think probably the best place to start for a discussion in regard to propaganda and corporations is with maybe the idea of free speech, because I think propaganda can be done in a lot of different ways. You can do it through images and whatnot, but a lot of it comes through speech. And what is speech? An image is speech, and so there's a long history of the progression of how speech has been viewed in regard to corporations. Are corporations individuals, or so do they even have the right to free speech? And what is free speech? What constitutes speech? So maybe you could give us a little bit of a history as far back as you can go, at least in regards to the United States. I know
Yeah.
that a lot of people think of Citizens United, but that's only like 2010, and I know that there's a history prior to that.
Yeah.
My understanding is that late 1800s there was some stuff that was going on and starting to change. So enlighten me, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not a historian and nor am I a lawyer. I just like to pretend I'm one. And so I'll talk a little bit about Citizens United, but I'll go back even further. I mean, this is something, the idea around free speech, right, is, obviously our Constitution and a lot of the ideas embodied in it come all the way back even before the United States was around, with England, issues with the king and the Enlightenment and things along those lines. And so, these have been long running ideas around the idea, particularly around free speech. There were colonial constitutions when we were still English colonies. For example, the Virginia Declaration of Rights included the ability around freedom of the press. Usually that's where speech kind of started with this concept, was around the press and being able to criticize leaders, right? It was this pushback against this idea of the divine right of kings. And so press should be able to criticize. And this was something that was attempted very early on, even in American history. I think a lot of people don't realize this, as soon as our founding fathers created and wrote down the Constitution, there were debates upon what it actually meant and how it applied pretty quickly. So, for example, President John Adams, the second president, kind of dealing with like a little mini war with pirates, I think it was the Barbary Pirates at the time, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. If you haven't heard of those, and one of them, essentially, the Sedition Act, made it illegal to criticize the federal government. And they tried to lock up like newspapers that were critical of the federal government. Now, technically, it had to be falsehoods, right? But when the government is the one who's in charge of arresting and charging you, and if you criticize them, what they deemed a falsehood was a pretty broad interpretation. And oftentimes they went after, so John Adams was a Federalist. They went after Democrat, Republican, or essentially Jeffersonian newspapers and tried to have them arrested. When the Jeffersonians took over, basically they repealed almost all the Alien and Sedition Acts, other than I think it's like the Alien Enemy Act, which essentially allows the president, and it's in effect today, it can be used, allows the president in wartime to essentially detain non-citizens. And so that is still on the books from the 1800s. But essentially, this idea of like the freedom of the press and freedom of speech, has been in conflict. Like, what does that actually mean? Pretty much since even our second president, believe it or not. The idea around corporations, I think really has certainly taken on much more of an issue. And you mentioned Citizens United. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get too much into legal analysis, but essentially the idea was there was a law at the time that said businesses, registered corporations could not engage in electioneering within a certain time frame before an election. So I think it was like 30 days before a primary, 60 days before a general. That might not be exactly, but you kind of get the idea. And a conservative group called Citizens United tried to challenge that. And essentially, they rested on the idea of the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And so essentially what happened was they said, look, you're politicking, right? The ability to talk politics is, if you could argue, is probably one of the most important types of speech, right? Particularly what the framers had in mind, right? Being able to talk about our civil government and everything, because they wanted to run ads, I think, that were critical of Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primary or something like that. And, the Supreme Court agreed, essentially, if nothing else, right? Maybe a corporation isn't a person, but it is an association of individuals, right? Essentially, that's what a corporation is a group of individuals who have joint or portions of ownership in a company. And so therefore individuals should not have their rights to free speech limited. And so that barrier was struck down. And the reason why is they applied an idea called strict scrutiny. If you go to law school or anything like that, you'll kind of understand this. Judges kind of come up with tests over time. The judicial system come up with tests. And the idea around strict scrutiny is if you are going to infringe on a constitutional right, it's a very high bar, right? And essentially you go into it assuming that the law is unconstitutional. And so for it to be upheld, the government has to prove there's an overwhelming and urgent need, and that the law that they have serves a very particular government interest, and it's extremely narrowly tailored to address the issue at hand, right? So it's a very high bar for the government to overcome to prove the constitutionality of that law. And essentially the ideas of corruption or anything like that from running ads, the justices didn't buy it, and said, you haven't met this idea of strict scrutiny in order for us to restrict an individual or a group of individuals through a corporation's right to politic. There are lower tests that courts apply called, like, for example, rational basis, which is basically the courts start from the position of, hey, we assume that this is constitutional, and as long as the government has a rational reason, it may not even be a good reason, may not even be correct, or there may be less restrictive ways to accomplish the end, it's okay. But we don't apply that usually to constitutional rights because they're seen as obviously the highest forms of rights that we have. And so that's essentially what happened. And so ever since then, right, we've, corporations being people, or obviously associations of people, they apply the idea of, of the press as an association to be able to talk in politic as much as they choose. So does that kind of answer your question, I think, or, best of my abilities probably. So
yeah, it definitely gets at it. And I want to dig a little bit deeper with the next question.
Okay.
So, we've got an idea that, okay, so we have a constitution, Bill of Rights, all that stuff, and it gives us some freedoms. And so if you're going to try to restrict a freedom or punish somebody in some way, then you need to prove that in a strict strict construction, strict scrutiny.
Yes.
So you need to prove that the burden of proof is on you. Okay, that kind of makes some sense.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're talking about communication, a lot of the authors that discuss propaganda mention that in democracies they are particularly susceptible to propaganda because free speech kind of has some loopholes in them in regard to it. So like democracies and especially capitalistic ones where you consumerism is important and freedom of choice in the market. They're built on pillars theoretically of rational discourse and informed consumers, right? Informed voters, whether you're consuming products or consuming politicians.
Sure.
But propositions then need to be accessible and able to be evaluated. Like that's what speech and discourse is.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the problems as you start to look into what a lot of corporate advertisement and corporate speech ends up being, what a lot of propaganda is that it's built around non-rational ideas. So, for example, one of the famous ones with, I think it was the first George Bush, the Willie Horton commercial, where they've got this, I forget who, you'd know who it was against. Who was the guy that he was
the facing? First time he ran?
Yeah.
Al Gore?
No, the first George Bush.
Oh, that was Bill Clinton. He ran against, when he won, was that George Dukakis, I think? Yeah, I think
it might have been Dukakis. But they had this commercial, a Willie Horton commercial. You can look it up on YouTube. And it's clearly dog whistling. Like it's it's an
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know the ad. I remember the ad.
yeah.
I forget who it was against. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just this one story, this black guy, the way that it's framed, it's kind of like, well, they're talking about this event that happens, but everything about it, you're like, oh, I know what they're really saying. And it's not really a rational discourse. It's not, okay, well, let's evaluate the policies that got Willie Horton out. Let's evaluate who's responsible for it. It's framed. And so it's not really rational discourse.
Right.
And corporations use that kind of stuff a lot, like to get at your emotions. And they're not really telling you about a product. If they were, they could just say, hey, here's our product. Here are all the pros for it. You know, here's the nutrition value.
Yeah.
Take it if you want it. But that's not what they do, because they know that that's not what triggers you to purchase something.
Sure.
So corporations, a lot of what they do, everybody who uses propaganda, but especially corporations, they seek to form desires and ideologies and associations within consumers. So it's kind of like the movie Inception, where they plant things inside of you.
Right.
And then when you're at the store, you're like, oh, I want that. And you don't know how to evaluate, well, why is it that I want that?
Sure.
So we see that there are laws against things like libel, slander, perjury, false advertising, certain forms of advertising which are even harmful to your health, like smoking in kids shows you can't do. Now, maybe you'd be for some of that, I don't know, but something like libel, well, why can't I have that free speech? Well, because when you say something that can be damaging to somebody else, or it can create false perceptions in somebody's mind, then that's a problem. So how do you deal with these ideas? We live in a democracy where rational discourse is really what we're trying to protect. Free speech is what we're protecting, but a lot of that is rational discourse that makes democracy run.
Sure.
At the same time, you've got, in particular in this episode, corporate free speech that kind of violates that a lot. So how do we synthesize those concepts here?
Yeah, well, okay, so a couple of things. I think first, it's always important to remember, right, is one, there's a reason why throughout history, people have been skeptical of democracies. We don't live in a democracy, right? We live in a republic, right? That's why we say to the republic for which it stands. The founding fathers essentially thought democracy was mob rule. Right. And so that's how you can get swaying of large populations. Right. Now how they try to go about creating an educated, rational voting public by basically limiting it to white male landowners. I'm not saying that was the way to do it, but there was an idea that they were like, yeah, we don't want everybody involved in making decisions, in a lot of, for the reasons why you're talking about. And I think in terms of the propaganda, though, I would argue that I would say that I think democracies or, republics are less likely to be swayed by propaganda because you can have various sources. Look at some of the states that have been most held by propaganda are the ones where there is no free speech, right? Like think about North Korea. There is no such thing as free speech or freedom of the press. I mean, and they think like because there's only state-sponsored news, which is essentially propaganda, right? There's a reason. What don't they think like they've won every World Cup or every medal in every Olympics? And that's obviously not true, but they completely believe it because it's the only source of information. Right. I mean, we, saw it even going to the Nazis and the strict censorship. I mean, and you want to talk about a population that was swayed to do obviously or go along with awful, horrible things. So I disagree that the fact that a, constitutional republic, democracy, whatever you want to say, is most susceptible to propaganda due to free speech. I would disagree with. I think history has shown that at the very least, when you have the ability to have competing ideas, it can balance things out. Obviously, it leads to division and, a lot of the stuff that we have today, so I'm not saying that there's no cost. So, I mean, I think that's one important point to think about. But in terms of like, balancing also some of the things around corporate propaganda and this idea around like libel and slander and all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, I mean, there isn't necessarily unlimited right to free speech. I mean, we have what are called like time manner restrictions, right? It's the whole idea you can't scream fire in a crowded theater, right? You know, we've all heard that example. The ideas around libel and slander are around not knowingly publishing falsehoods that damage somebody's reputation and cause harm, right? But I think a lot of that kind of stuff often comes back to the idea of harm, right? I mean, most of our laws started off with this idea of fixing wrongs, right? I mean, that's why we have punishments for criminal crimes, right? It's to make whole, or civil lawsuits. Like if I injure you, you know, you can sue me for the harm that I've caused. That's the idea around libel, slander, and a lot of those things, or like, you know, knowingly deceptive false advertising, right? It's you're trying to defraud essentially somebody knowingly. And so that's kind of a lot of the checks that we have, right? I mean, that's the whole idea around like screaming fire in a crowded theater. One, you can cause harm to people in a mass panic, but two, you've also caused monetary harm to the theater owner by essentially interrupting the show and people leaving, right? And so a lot of these, you know, restrictions we have are around that idea. I think, let's see, what else do you think you want to touch on? There was a lot in that kind of question or anything.
Yeah, maybe just to before we kind of move on or dig deeper, some of the things that you said. You know, if I said that democracies are the most susceptible, that's not what I intended to convey. But they said that there is a susceptibility. They're particularly vulnerable in the sense that, so sometimes you'll see people like Richard Dawkins is a famous example. So he's this staunch atheist, and he refuses to debate Christians like William Lane Craig, because he says, I'm not going to give that position validity, because by engaging with the idea, you give it validity. So, you know, do you have a debate on the humanity and value of Jews or Black people with somebody from the KKK? Right. No, you're not going to have a debate on that, because by having a debate, you give some sense of credibility or credence to some people who'd be looking on and saying, hey, you know what? Well, that he made some good points. I thought the idea was crazy, but well, if they're engaging in debate, like maybe there is something to it. And so you'll have people who don't want to engage with certain fringe ideas.
Gotcha.
So as not to give them validity.
I mean, I think maybe it's not necessarily you want to give them as much time of the light of day, but I do think that there is merit in allowing people essentially to trip themselves up in awful ideas. And I think most people are going to realize that, right? I mean, there's the old saying of Voltaire of, you know, I may disagree with you, but I defend your right to say it. Or even think about the ACLU when it defended the Nazis' ability to parade down Skokie, right? You know, unfortunately, the First Amendment, the idea of free speech, is not there to talk about the weather. It's there to talk about controversial things, right? And so, you know, I don't think by having the Nazis parade down Skokie in Illinois, it lended credence to Nazi ideas, you know. So, I mean, that's a personal opinion of mine. You know, and yeah, I'm not saying that democracies are the most susceptible, but I mean, I think it's a human nature, right? And so at the very least, in an idea of free speech, we have the ability to kind of like have those ideas play out against each other. You know what I mean? So
then, you know, the other thing that you mentioned was with something like libel, you know, you're causing damage or harm to somebody else. So if I think about Bush's Willie Horton advertisement, and I think about what he was saying without actually saying it, that causes damage to the other party, because people make decisions based on what they infer from particular advertisements. I mean, what constitutes damage? What constitutes speech? It seems like it's very fuzzy.
It is. You're right. I mean, that, you know, that's why we have, obviously, courts have played this kind of stuff out for forever. I mean, trust me, I have seen some political ads that I just see here in the state. Like, for example, this is a true story. we had a congressional race here in Nashville area, and um, I mean, it's almost laughable to think about. One of the candidates for the Republican nominee for this congressional seat, right, in the primary, it was a primary race, and it was one of those races where the primary is the real election, essentially. And one of the candidates was the former Tennessee Speaker of the House. And she had voted years ago to allow illegal immigrants to have driver's licenses. Okay. And literally there was an attack ad on her where, hey, they showed her voting for allowing illegal immigrants to have voter licenses, which was a true fact, right? But then the ad continued with, hey, the people who bombed 9/11 got illegal driver's licenses, and therefore she supported 9/11, right? And you're just like, I mean, it was laughable on its face. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, I mean, and clearly like falsehoods that she supported 9/11, but that was an ad that was a real thing here in Metro Nashville this past fall. And, where is that line in terms of like causing harm and falsehoods? Now, I don't think it probably caused a whole lot of harm, just because I think it was so laughable on its face that hopefully nobody was really swayed by that, but you never know. But you're right, it is fuzzy. I mean, and that's why, you have civil lawsuits and litigants that kind of figure that out. When does it cross that line? We have, generally different standards for public figures, right? You've probably heard about that, the idea of like publishing somebody's dirty laundry that's just an average citizen versus a well-known politician, right? We've kind of over time developed these different standards, but it's something that plays out all the time. You're right. It's a fuzzy area.
Yeah. I want to move a little bit more into the practical from the theoretical and murky, and I want you to just kind of lay out how some of this stuff has played out.
Sure.
So I know you've seen some things in your time in politics in regard to corporate influence. So I want to know things like how much legislation is influenced or controlled by corporate lobbyists. How many resources are they throwing at this? And do you have any specific examples of that kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it happens all the time. I mean, here's what I'll tell you, at least at the state level. Okay, which, is a whole separate discussion, in that I don't think people pay enough attention to the state level. I think we all generally know hardly anything ever happens in Washington, right? Whereas your state government is going to pass hundreds of laws every single year, they pass as many as Congress does practically in a decade every single year, generally. And so, I would say the vast majority of laws or proposed laws come from some kind of special interest. I'm just going to be real with you. Most state elected officials, for example, don't necessarily have a whole lot of ideas in terms of what they want to run as a bill. They run on principles generally, and then they get elected, and then people come to them with specific ideas for bills and legislation. To the point of like, it's almost, I don't want to say a joke, but like, I have seen it where a state lawmaker will say, like, I actually thought of this one myself, like, because nobody came to them. I mean, and part of it is just going to be the fact of the matter is that, you can't be an expert on everything, right? And so they know their area, or their general, like if they're a business owner or a farmer or something like that, they know their one thing, right? And they maybe have principles that kind of guide them generally about specific topics. And then it's usually some kind of, quote unquote special interest that says, hey, you say you stand for this, here's an idea for you, right? And I think special interest is maybe we should talk a little bit about that, but like, yeah, sometimes that's specific companies, right? Sometimes that's most people probably don't realize that there's a good chance that they have a lobbyist that represents their profession. And so chances are most people are a special interest, right? Even if they don't realize it. If you're a teacher, for example, you better believe there is a lobbyist that represents, whether it's your teachers union or in a teachers association, right, to lobby for the special interest of teachers, right? Professional associations is very common. And then there's a very small group of nonprofits that represent usually issues or ideas. For example, the organization that I work at. But yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about like how much of the laws that are out there are influenced by associations, organizations, corporations that get them at least introduced, it's a very, very, very high percentage, particularly at the state level. Like I would say 85%, 90%.
Yeah, but you make a good point that, okay, a politician gets in office, they don't know about farming, or if they do know about farming, they don't know about teaching, or all the many, many things. So it doesn't make sense to have experts come to you. I think maybe one of the things that makes me a little bit more uncomfortable. I just talked to my cousin, and he was in the FDA for a bit. Now he's a consultant. I've talked to some friends who've been in the Army, and read a number of books where people talk about the way that the system works. You go in, you come out, and you do consulting, and it's this revolving door.
Oh yeah.
And you go, you get a lobbyist, and then you get out of politics, and now you have a nice cushy job in that. It just seems it seems very I don't know, self-interested and muddy.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are many former lawmakers that go on to then become lobbyists, or employees of different departments that become lobbyists, or legislative aides, like I used to be, that go on to become lobbyists for different associations or for-profit lobbying companies, who basically, almost like a lawyer, they don't represent a specific company, they are a business, and they try and get clients that then they turn around and represent. And I think it comes down to, at that kind of level, generally, the currency of politics is relationships, right? Is a good way to put it, I think, is the idea that if somebody has a relationship with somebody, right, they are more likely to get in the door and have their idea heard. Like, take the word lobbying, right? It's literally about sitting in a lobby, hoping to be able to interact with that decision maker, right? And so the currency of that is relationships, and being able to get in the door and meet with someone. So for example, I mean, it just is a matter of fact that, when you're an elected representative, right, you represent tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, and sometimes you're kind of approached by crazy people, right? And so if it's somebody that and that you trust, and they're like, hey, I want to talk to you about something, just because of that longstanding relationship that you have, you're much more likely to at least hear them out and get, them the right idea. Like I'll talk about, for example, this past year, my organization worked on a bill around food trucks, where food trucks, if you think about it, are obviously mobile businesses. And so the problem is they often face a patchwork of regulations when they travel around. So they go from city carnival to fair or whatever, and they can face a very different regulatory environment in every city that they want to operate, which makes it incredibly difficult, right? In some cities, they have to pay a permit every single day they want to operate. In some, they're banned completely. In some, they face extremely protectionist regulations. So, for example, some cities, to protect brick and mortar restaurants over food trucks, say, hey, you can't be within so many feet of a brick and mortar restaurant. Or like, there's one city in Tennessee that says, hey, if you sell you can't be within a certain distance of a brick and mortar restaurant that serves a similar type of food as your food truck. So for example, if you sell tacos out of a food truck, you couldn't be within a quarter of a mile of a Mexican restaurant, right? But we can have KFC and Chick-fil-A, two brick and mortar places right next to each other, but we couldn't have a food truck. And so anyways, we wanted to just say, hey, if a food truck wants to operate on private property, they can do so. Cities can regulate as much as they want, ban whatever on public roads, public parks, all that. But if I'm having a pool party or a birthday party for my child and I want to have a food truck over to serve my party, my guests, whatever, you can't ban that. And we thought we started to get movement until cities band together to kill it. And essentially what happened is every lawmaker that was going to have to vote on our bill got a call from their local mayor, right? And said, don't do this. This is a local issue. We should be able to regulate or ban these or however we want. And we lost the votes within a matter of an hour, essentially, right? That's a true story. I went into a committee thinking I had the vote like 15-5. And within an hour beforehand, it swapped from 5 to 15 because every single one got a call from their mayor. And so that goes to that idea of influence that I talked about, right? Like if you're a state politician and one of your local mayors calls you, that mayor just has access, through connection and influence that an average person didn't have. So we had food trucks that were their own constituents just saying, hey, I just want to operate my business. But it didn't matter because they weren't as influential. They didn't have the relationship that a city mayor did with that state representative. And so they listened to one mayor over 10 constituents, as an example.
So maybe it's a stretch, but that it feels like such a double standard to me that we protect corporate speech, right? And I know it's probably a push to say that this is freedom of assembly for me to have a pool party and have a food truck there, but it seems like if it's on private property, like that's a right. So
yeah.
And that's where it's such a struggle here because for me, because I understand the importance of free speech, but I think that a lot of the ways that we see corporate speech, it's not really rational speech, and then at the same time, it's used to curb the rights of other people, generally people with less money. So food trucks, I would take it have less money than KFC and the brick and mortar stores probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Now, that was an example of other politicians using speech, but I mean, that kind of happens all the time where essentially larger corporations use speech to essentially gain a monopoly. I mean, that happens all the time. The term is called rent seeking or political entrepreneurship. And because the idea is, let's say you're a business, right? You're a large company that is facing some kind of upstart competitor, right? And you have two choices. You either have compete through the market, which can cost, I'm just going to make up numbers, $100 million through sales, ad campaigns, all that. Or you can spend $2 million or even less than that. Oftentimes, let's say you spend $100,000 on a lobbyist to restrict your competition, right? Through some form or measure. Well, in terms of a business's profit motives, it's like we could spend millions of dollars or tens of thousands on a lobbying effort and gain the same advantage. Why shouldn't we take that route, right? I'll give you an example. We were dealing with one time around this idea of auctions, and so generally auctions or auctioneering is licensed. It's a licensed profession in most states, right? If you want to be an auctioneer, you have to get a government license in order to do that in most states. And the idea around that is fraud, handling money, all that kind of stuff. Well, as you can imagine, the auctioneering industry is kind of going the way of the dodo bird, as with the internet and technology and eBay and things like that, right? And so here in Tennessee, one year we had this idea of extending online auctions or extending the auctioneering license to online auctions and essentially regulating the internet, right? Well, essentially what happened was eBay was like, well, that's not going to happen. That hurts our business model. And so they had a lobbying effort and got themselves exempted from the bill, right? Now, they didn't care that anybody else was going to be regulated. They knew that they weren't going to be regulated. And some other ones, Copart, which is like a car part manufacturing and automobile, like online auction site, they got exempted. But we found some small businesses who didn't run that. And we're like, wait a second. So now I'm going to be regulated when my big competition isn't, right? And so our organization actually sued that. Also on First One, you're regulating online commerce. It's a form of speech. So we actually got that struck down on First Amendment grounds, but also the Commerce Clause, because essentially you could be out of state running an auction business and have Tennessee clients, which required you to be regulated, which states don't have the ability to regulate the internet because it's interstate commerce. But it's a great example of a large business just saying, hey, instead of dealing with this, we'll hire a lobbying effort to get ourselves exempted or get ourselves a favor, right? And beat our competition through that way. Like the very first example I ever saw this, and I think we've talked about this before, and it's kind of what led me down a rabbit hole of there's a difference between what we are today and what we call capitalism and what really is. And it was dealt with Delta when I worked in the Georgia General Assembly. After 9/11, obviously the airline industry was extremely hurt, right? People were afraid of flying, and Atlanta has the largest airport in the world. And Delta's their number one employer. The airport's the number one employer generally as an industry, as a place. And so it was going to be a huge impact on Georgia and Atlanta's economy. And so what they did was they said, okay, hey, for a period of time, we're going to essentially cut the sales tax on jet fuel, right? And so it reduced the cost for all airlines, which, I think that's a general thing because it impacted everybody equally. So it wasn't an issue. When it came back up to be renewed, only Delta was able to get the credit going forward, right? Only Delta was. And that was through a strong lobbying effort. And I saw that play out in real time where there were elected officials that were really struggling about, I don't think it's fair, but Delta's the number one employer. They're saying they're going to leave Atlanta if we don't do this for them, which I always think is overblown, right? I know you want to talk about stadiums, which is another area that this plays out, but Delta was able to get it. And within several years, AirTran, which was also based out of Atlanta, went bankrupt, right? Now, do I think it's solely because of that? I don't think so. But the idea that they had to compete, it's the same business, same industry, same place, but just because they weren't as big as Delta, they didn't get the same tax break, right? And so you can see this all the time, how much rent seeking plays out in politics all the time.
So one of the things that you said, I think back when we were talking about the food trucks, you said that it's not so much corporate propaganda, it's politicians doing these things. But I guess from my novice understanding, it would seem like the reason that the politicians want something or advocate for something is because the businesses who fund their campaigns are telling them to do that. And so even if it's the politicians, aren't the politicians by and large the mouthpiece of corporations? And again, I know that you can couch it kind of as, well, yeah, but those are the people that they have relationships with. And I'm sure that's true to some extent. Like sometimes it is just relational. But me, as just a lone individual, I'd be thinking, okay, well, that's great. But what you're telling me is that I'm not going to have a relationship with my senator. Really, the relationship revolves around who has money. So what talks isn't speech. What talks is money. Money is speech in politics.
Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree with that to a large extent. You know, it's a problem of incentives, right? Where unfortunately most politicians' number one incentive once they become elected is to stay elected, right? And how they do that is through campaigning, which requires funds. And so who donates to campaigns, right, usually gets that influence, right? That opportunity to at least get in the door, you know? And so it's obviously a combination of somebody that's been there for a while, that has, you know, long-standing relationships. But yeah, a lot of it also comes from who's going to help donate to my campaign, right? I mean, there's a saying, you know, talking about political influence here, and it's like, it's not the last check that matters, it's the next one, right? And so politicians are usually very deferential to make sure that they get that next check that helps them fill up their campaign coffers, right? And so what they're willing to do, or at least talk to hear out in order to, you know, to get that donation to fund that campaign is exactly that. So yeah.
All right. My next question, as I'm looking at it, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it the best. So hopefully you'll understand what I'm trying to say, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So a lot of what we've been talking about has been more like positive sorts of bills that are put in place. Have you ever seen anything like, let's say there's a lot of social upheaval about, say, global warming, and like everybody really wants it, and but then industries, corporations are able to kind of divert that attention to something else, or kind of deflect a bill that's maybe going against them and sway public.
Yeah. What I can give a specific example of is actually almost the opposite, and that's what made it so unusual. Maybe that's the most specific answer I can give. Was and you know, I'm not saying anything of where I stood or particularly my organization stood on this, but as a result of COVID, right, there were a lot of thoughts about what can or should a business be able to require of its employees and all that kind of stuff, right? And typically, you know, small business owners are very influential members or people, I should say, particularly of state and local elected officials. But there was such a clamoring from grassroots folks in Tennessee that they shouldn't be fired or banned from not refusing to, you know, get a vaccine if their employer required it, that they actually went against business interests. And it was so remarkable that for once they're like, hey, to our friends in the business community, right? I mean, I can even play the clips like, I know that this isn't something that we would normally do, is go against your wishes in essentially, so you know, on certain terms, but we have heard such outcry around this that we have to, you know. So I can't say that I've heard where they've diverted or squashed, but I've seen a specific example of where like it was so unusual that they didn't side with, you know, particular businesses. One that I can think of.
Yeah, because that's a good example. What I was thinking of, and maybe you haven't seen it, but there was this, I don't know if it was a Stanford study or something, but there's this.
I do have one example that's not necessarily by a corporation, but kind of a similar example.
Okay.
Go ahead and finish. Sorry.
Yeah, so there's this Stanford study, and they were trying to determine what influences public policy. And so
Mhm.
they have this graph, and it says, okay, what you would expect is that if public policy followed public opinion, you'd expect this linear graph. The more public opinion, the higher the public opinion, the higher the chance of this
Something happening.
law being passed.
Yeah.
But what they show is that, okay, right around 30% is where, or 50 or something, I think it was 30, is kind of like, it doesn't matter where public opinion is, 30% is the chance of a bill getting passed.
Mhm.
What they do show is that there is an almost linear graph with in terms of lobbying or corporate influence on a
Sure.
bill, corporate desires. Now, I've heard some people kind of push back against the study. So and how do you determine the methodology of how strong a public opinion is and how strong corporate influence is?
Right.
It's nebulous, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And so that's kind of what I was
Yeah.
wondering is if public policy follows corporate interests, but corporate interests don't want to be the bad guys, how are they able to kind of create the public opinion
Right.
to center around the bills that they're passing?
Well, I think it comes always down to the idea of the vocal or influential minority over the will of a silent majority, right? So a great example of that, and this is where I was going, like I said, it's not a corporate interest, but it's similar vein where in a lot of states still, particularly conservative states, right? Public opinion is overwhelmingly for, if not recreational, at least medical marijuana, right? Like overwhelmingly.
You said particularly in conservative states.
Yes. Well,
see, that kind of surprises me.
Well, but oftentimes it's not the case. It's still illegal, is what I'm saying in conservative states. There isn't a huge difference between blue states and red states around medical marijuana. But yet still there are many red states that have not passed any kind of marijuana legalization, including my home state of Tennessee, because of influence from cops. It's what it boils down to. The vast majority of people support at least medical marijuana. Like recreational is a little bit different, but on the medical side, it is extremely popular. It's like 80%, right? Plus. But yet, because cops don't like it in a lot of states, it is often defeated, particularly in red states, because, got to back the blue, want to be seen as pro-police and the influence that your local sheriffs, policemen have with state elected officials, even though it is extremely popular, particularly as, in the aftermath of, I shouldn't say aftermath, but the result of the opioid crisis, right, as an alternative to a painkiller, recreational marijuana is even popular amongst, people that were very anti-marijuana even 10 years ago. But in many red states, it's still not allowed because of influence from police. So that's a great example of like that public opinion, right? Or one that I've personally seen that I've worked on, like I said, is not a corporate specific interest, but similar that same vein in terms of public opinion doesn't necessarily make policy. Tennessee is one of the 4 states that doesn't have a cap on the growth of property taxes. Now, Tennessee is very often considered a low tax state, right? It's one of the few states that doesn't have an income tax, all that kind of stuff. But along with Vermont, Hawaii, and New Hampshire, it is one of 4 states that does not have a cap on the growth of property taxes. Those states, at least particularly Vermont and Hawaii, are extremely blue. And then you have Tennessee, very, very red. We did a poll. We tried to say, hey, we're not saying you can't increase property taxes, but we had a bill once that if you want to increase it by more than a certain percentage, you've got to get a voter referendum approval to do so. We polled it. It was like 95% approval rating amongst voters. Like that's like maybe even higher than Jesus numbers, right? In terms of a poll favorability. And it didn't stand a chance because local governments using their influence, essentially the government that local people support through taxes, use their tax dollars to lobby against something that would have helped their own constituents, right? So I've seen that. That's a personal example, but I mean, I think it always comes back to that vocal, influential minority rather than a diffuse silent majority. So explains a lot of what you're talking about there.
And I guess that's why you say that local matters more, because nobody's paying attention to what happens locally. Right. So therefore, because I'm like, well, how do those people get reelected? Well, because that's not on the nightly news.
Exactly. Yeah. More people know like things that, Ted Cruz or AOC say than somebody that actually represents them in their own backyard at their state capitol, right? I mean, because we've nationalized everything essentially.
So going back to what you said about the police and marijuana, is that, and maybe you don't know, but is that kind of like with war? I think a lot of times there's this idea that, well, and like investments, right? Gambling. So if you lose but you play and you play and play and you keep losing, it's kind of like, well, I've invested all of this money and now I have to keep playing to get my money out of it. Is it kind of like that, where the police are like, hey, look, if right now we say that we're not going to criminalize marijuana, that invalidates my life for my whole career, because now you're telling me that what I did was worthless. It was pointless. It was maybe even wrong that we were locking those people up. Do you know what the rationale behind that is?
I mean, I'm sure that's part of it. You're talking about like some cost fallacy. I think part of it is it just makes their job more difficult. I think part of it is it's, marijuana is used as a reason to stop and look for other things, right? It's usually like, I use this, for people listening, I'm using air quotes, like a gateway investigation, right? Like, the whole joke of it being a gateway drug, right? It's like, it's the same thing with like, tail lights, right? If we criminalize having your tail light out, it gives me an opportunity to stop you and search for other things, right? And so I think that's part of it as well, So I think there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, I think some of it is just legitimate in terms of enforcement of like, okay, if I'm a standard police officer, I catch somebody with marijuana and they say it's a prescription. How am I as a cop supposed to determine, is this a valid prescription or not? Like, I mean, I think there's, some legitimate concerns over the enforcement of that, right? And how do you deal with that in the moment? But the idea like that's hasn't been figured out by a lot of other states now at this point, is kind of silly, right? And so I mean, I think there's a variety of factors as to why that happens.
Yeah, that's just crazy when you're talking about people's lives,
Yeah.
That, well, if we just keep it illegal and we keep sending people to jail and we keep using all that tax money, do you think any of it's also, it's not, I don't think it's eminent domain. What's the eminent domain?
Civil asset forfeiture.
There you go. Yeah. Do you think that maybe has something to do with it too?
Oh, I think personally, absolutely. Right. There's a report, for example, that before I got to where I work now, our organization worked on some civil asset forfeiture reform. Getting rid of it is extremely difficult, but we were able to get some reporting requirements around it. Like, hey, every police department or sheriff's office, you have to at least report what you have taken, right, through civil asset forfeiture. And the idea around it is that money or whatever was being used in the process of a crime, right? But I remember the first time I ever read it, it was like, it included like I think there were like 3 trombones and a flute that had been seized one year. I'm like, what does that have to do with anything, And so it's just some of the funny stuff you see. But yeah, I think that's possibly part of it. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. So.
Right. Okay. That's probably safest thing to do. And I mean, there usually isn't just one answer and just a simple answer. There's a multitude of answers.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So to kind of move just a little bit further, and maybe this is a little bit off base, but one of the examples when I think of, I would call it corruption, maybe, or kickbacks, is sports stadiums. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't understand how it works. Maybe it's great, but you build these. I mean, the price of these things. What I don't remember what the Cowboys stadium was, but it was 1 billion, maybe 2. I don't remember what it was, but we're talking billions.
I mean, that's pretty cheap now, actually.
Oh, really?
SoFi Stadium, where the Rams play and the Chargers play, I think is the most expensive stadium, and I think that was like 7 billion, maybe, or 5 billion, something like that. I think it was 5 billion, 5 billion plus.
Do you know what percentage was paid by taxes?
So actually, funny story, that's the first time really in a long time that it wasn't. It was completely privately funded, SoFi Stadium. But this is very near and dear to my heart right now, because the Tennessee Titans are getting a new stadium, and it is the largest public subsidy of a football stadium in American history. Their new stadium is going to be about $2.2 billion. And the state alone has offered $500 million towards it. So,
well, there you go. Your property taxes.
Yeah. Well, the sales taxes, because it's from the state, but yeah. So yes. So I'm very familiar with this subject. I've done a lot of work on it, and unfortunately have lost.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe you can kind of elaborate then, or maybe there's not really anything to elaborate on. Maybe it's as simple as it looks. But so you get these billion-dollar stadiums, these investments, a lot of times subsidized substantially by the state.
Yep.
To me, it seems extravagant and wasteful, and it seems like there are probably a lot of people benefiting. Construction companies, the sports teams themselves, the owners, wealthy investors.
Yeah.
Is there something more to sports stadiums, or is this a good example of kind of being sold something that's really not true? Like it benefits me.
Yeah, it's really funny in a world of division around a lot of things in this country. Actually, sports stadiums is something where both sides of economists agree is they make no sense whatsoever. Is stadium subsidies. They are woefully inefficient. Seriously, they're a terrible deal for taxpayers. And essentially why they happen is exactly what you described, right? Special interests from construction, tourism offices, tourism economic development agencies, obviously the billionaire families, right? And it's sold through what I would call press clip economics, right? If we do this, we're going to have, the Super Bowl, and we're going to have all these people, tourists coming here, and all this kind of stuff, that's going to pay. It's going to pay for itself. It never does. First, a couple of things. What always ends up happening, a new stadium does not make the difference between somebody coming to a city to view a game, right? It doesn't work. They come there for the game itself, regardless of the stadium, right? Second, it doesn't lead people to spend more money. It just diverts their spending. So a lot of studies show this, that you spend a bunch of money on a new stadium. Yeah, maybe you go to a game now, but that money that you were going to spend on tickets, maybe you would have gone to buying clothes or going to restaurants or movies or something, some other discretionary spending. So it doesn't create more spending, it just diverts it. And then the idea around like one-time events like the Super Bowl or Final Four, they're woefully exaggerated, studies have shown. And most of the benefits for them come from the existing stadium. So you have these massive investments for an incremental benefit. Usually it's like, all right, you already had a team, you already had games, right? Oh, you spend billions of dollars on a new stadium to have a one-time event like the Super Bowl, So it doesn't create billions of dollars in value to have 1 week, of the Super Bowl. Some studies have shown, for example, that like a baseball stadium, right, which has a lot more home games than a football stadium does. Was it like, I'm not a baseball guy, but like 80 some odd home games plus playoffs, has the average economic impact of a mid-sized department store like a Kohl's, because a Kohl's is open every day and people come in and spend money, whereas so much of the time stadiums just sit there empty. And this is something like left-leaning organizations like Brookings or Stanford University has found that. The Mercatus Center, which is very right-leaning or conservative libertarian, it is terrible economics. They don't create economic growth. They're a huge waste. They cost taxpayers millions, if not billions of dollars. All that. So you're not wrong.
So then how do they keep happening? Is it because, like you said, we don't pay attention locally? I mean, everybody, if there's a stadium being built in your city, it happens and what's happening. You know that it's coming from your tax money.
Right.
But is it because you don't associate it? Like when I go to pay my taxes, it's not like it's itemized. It's not like there's a line item like, well, this percentage of your taxes went and paid for the stadium. Like, what goes into that to keeping me from firing all of my congressmen?
Yeah, exactly. It goes back to that idea of diffuse benefits and diffuse costs, concentrated benefits, right? Like, yeah, you're right. In the grand scheme of things, right, it might cost you $100 of your taxes towards a new stadium. Is that going to get you all fired up to go and pick it outside City Hall, or go, travel to your capital if you don't live there, to sit down with your state representative when they're going to be voting on it and they have like 4 days notice, right? I mean, that's something that often people don't realize is like, it's not like exactly when something is going to be coming up, often much long in advance. And so, you're a busy guy, or your dad with, bunch of kids and all that. Like you don't have as much time to go and care and fight for something that maybe will cost you $150 or something like that of your taxes. But when you multiply that by every single person in a city or in a state, it's hundreds of millions. Meanwhile, that, construction industry or that billionaire family, right, that owns the will own the football stadium, you better believe it's worth their time, right? You better believe it, because they're getting all the benefits where the costs are diffused amongst the general population. I think that has a lot to do with it. You're right. It's not itemized. This gets talked about like with corn subsidies, a lot at the federal level, right? Like if corn subsidies make no sense economically, but it would be like $1 off your federal taxes, right, every year. Well, you're not going to care about that. You're not going to get engaged over $1. But for like 350 million, right, that go to 100 farmers in Iowa and Nebraska, you better believe it's worth their time, right? I mean, so that's just an incentive problem that we have in governance. And oftentimes then too, it's a positive thing for those politicians. They get to have their ribbon cutting ceremonies, breaking ground, all that kind of stuff, right? I called it press clips economics, and the idea that then they can take credit for, look how many jobs we've created, right? Through the construction and all that kind of stuff too. So there's sometimes strong incentives for politicians to make these kind of decisions, even if they don't make economic sense, right? They make political sense, and that's often what it boils down to, like we talked about, because remember, their number one incentive usually is to get reelected.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I don't know, I'm a happy person, and I'm optimistic in the sense that I enjoy life, and I'm not worried about the world ending tomorrow, even though I think it probably will, but I'm not worried about it. But going through this season and doing a lot of research on various areas, it certainly makes me makes me really cynical about the world, about people, about life, about a lot of things. So right now, I want to talk to you a little bit. You've given a really good picture, and I love every time I talk to you, you always give very specific examples. And I love that you can kind of bring ideas to life. So that's extremely helpful. But right now, I want to talk to you more as a Christian,
Sure.
and kind of get at the, okay, well, what do we do with all of this, and how do you kind of come to the conclusions? How do you live life? Seeing the things that you see, and probably much more than what you've expressed today. But how do you move out from there? So as a Christian who values business, who values hard work and a free market, as somebody who values politics, I mean, that's your life. You're passionate about it because you're able to help food truck people when the brick and mortar stores want, or eBay or whatever wants to kind of, or is content to have them taxed or disadvantaged. But then also, it's not because you just want, instead of eBay getting a piece of the pie, you want a piece of the pie and you just want to be rich. Like, you enjoy helping others and giving to others and seeking justice and love. So how do you live in that world, seeing all of those things and creating, forming, and extending the values that you have? Like, what practices do you have? What ideologies do you cling to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, it boils down to, right, as God's children, right, we are told to go forth, multiply, and essentially prosper, right? It was one of the first commandments he gave us. And I have found, or believe nothing helps human flourishing more than freedom. And so what I am always looking to do is to allow for human flourishing, and essentially, what are the ways that we inhibit that? And generally, I have found in my understanding of history and what I've seen personally, it's government getting in the way, right, or picking winners and losers often, right, which is a lot of the examples that we've talked about today. And so fighting for those food truck operators just wanting to operate their business. I've talked, can give you a lot of examples of like people who were threatened with jail time for massaging horses because they were told they were being a vet, even though they were just massaging a horse. And fighting for them to be able to run a horse massage business. It's because I want to allow people to live their version of, an American dream, but essentially for them to flourish in a way that makes the most sense for them. And so what are the ways that I can help serve to essentially, one, either get government out of the way or put everyone on a level playing field so that way they can, find a way to flourish. And I've generally found and believe that freedom and free markets is peaceful. It's the most peaceful way of interacting in terms of a society and economics, and it leads to the most human flourishing. And that's something that I think want to see, and so that plays out in, fighting for respective property rights. It's fighting for reductions and regulations or whatever. So, does that answer the question, I think?
Yeah. So freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom is big. And so if I understand it correctly, you are trying to use the government to fight itself, like to push back against itself. It's encroachment.
Restrain itself. I will say restrain itself.
Okay.
Yeah. So generally, I think a lot of the reasons why we've seen, for example, take the stadiums, for example, right? A lot of the reasons why you have these bad decisions or unfair decisions and all that is because usually government has the ability to act in a certain area. And so it allows an arena, right, for special interests, large businesses, in order to use their influence and money to take advantage of a system, you know? And so if you get, the less the government is involved in my opinion, then you have less opportunities for those with more resources, more time, more connection to take advantage of the system, right? So it kind of goes back to that example of rent seeking that I mentioned, right? Like if a business has to, spend $100 million in competing in the market versus $1 million in a lobbying effort, they're always going to choose the lobbying effort because it makes financial sense. But if they don't have that ability because government doesn't decide that issue, then they have to compete on the market side, and that puts everybody at a level playing field. So what I try and do is get the government less involved and essentially restrain itself so that way people are free to flourish as best they can and compete evenly. So,
okay. All right. And that kind of brings me to the closing idea I want you to touch on. When you talk about corporations, I think obviously everybody's minds goes to capitalism, and even though you have corporations in more socialistic countries, and capitalism, socialism, it really is more of a spectrum. It's not like you have pure free markets and such. So, and I would say that capitalism seems to be trending downward in the eyes of a lot of society, I think. And you've helped me to, I'm very pessimistic about capitalism a lot of times because, talking about money and the influence that money has, and on free markets, somebody's going to accrue a lot of money. And when they do, what power and money do and how you can use that, it's always going to lead to terrible, terrible things. But at the same time, you mentioned North Korea earlier. We know that I'm also very skeptical and pessimistic about socialism and communism,
right?
Which is why anarchism makes a lot of sense to me, because I'm like, every system is just really, really messed up.
What's the common denominator in all of it, right? It's people,
government.
Right?
Yeah, it's government. So that's why I can respect what you do, because you're not trying to get your party to just be the strongest and go and bludgeon everybody else. You're trying to, even though you're using government, you're trying to restrain it. And so I respect and appreciate that. So maybe we've done a lot of talking about corporations and what would be more capitalistic ideas and how money and capital and corporations can in that system can propagandize and influence. But I think it would be unfair to just completely focus on that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the flip side of the spectrum, maybe some specific examples from history, from around the world, from maybe even in the United States, some socialistic aspects of things that have occurred here throughout our history, and how you've kind of seen propaganda or conspiracy and those types of things show forth in that system.
So how have we seen like propaganda in like socialist systems and communist systems?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I think you just have to look, for example, the freedom of the press, right? Where in communist socialist systems, right, there generally isn't a freedom of the press, the ability to criticize rulers. And so, here's what I always think about, right, is propaganda exists, right? We've talked a lot about corporate propaganda and tricking you into buying things or trying to play on emotion rather than just logical reasoning and facts, right? But I would always argue that government propaganda is the worst because they have the ability to do it at the power of a gun, and so if they can outlaw competition, for example, or essentially prohibit criticisms of it, right? I mean, I think we've seen tons of examples of propaganda from those kind of systems, I mean, like I said, literally, I'm pretty sure North Korea believes they've won every World Cup, like that only exists through propaganda, and look, the United States government has done it too, right? I mean, obviously the idea of trying to invade Iraq, for nuclear weapons was kind of a propaganda effort, the axis of evil. The first ministry of propaganda ever created was in the United States by Woodrow Wilson in World War I, right? In the lead up of World War I. So, now propaganda kind of had a different meaning back then. So, I want to be fair. But I mean, I think we've seen it all everywhere. But the difference is like I said, it comes back to that marketplace of ideas rather than only one source. Propaganda is very dangerous when there's nobody else to criticize it or push back, and that doesn't exist here because we do have a marketplace of ideas, a freedom of ideas. People talk about frustrations in America around the media, right? Both the right and left, right? Talk about frustrations with mainstream media or the left was very critical of how President Trump treated the news media, well, in other countries, Trump could have easily had people locked up who criticized him on the media, right? I mean, that happens all the time. Russia, China, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I think
it seems to me like there's maybe two different ends of the spectrum where maybe like if you're familiar with Orwell, 1984, that's kind of the communist end. But then you've also got Huxley, who has more of the there's a different end. You can silence, which is I think what communist countries do, but then you can also inundate. And when you inundate, even if you have competing voices, it's easier for them to be drowned out.
Sure.
Or for you to be sedated. So, but you at least, right, you have some semblance of a choice there.
Yeah. Well, I'm not as familiar with Huxley, but I think also what's always very ironic to me is Orwell was not like a freedom. He was a socialist. He was against what he would call like Stalinist communism, right? Like, the whole like, oh, well, communism's never really been tried before, right? It's like, oh, they did it wrong, right? That's always, there's a joke about that from freedom-loving people criticizing communists. It's like, oh, well, we say it's never worked, and they say, oh, well, it's just never been correctly done. Orwell was like that, right? He was a socialist, but was against the whole Stalinist idea of socialism and communism, and he believed in the true sense, So,
yeah, my people didn't have the guns, so
exactly.
It wasn't really
exactly. So that's and it's funny because people on the right use Orwell to make fun of or to point out problems. I shouldn't say make fun of, but to point out like, oh, this is just like 1984. Orwell was right. Look at Big Brother, all that kind of stuff. But he was a socialist, which I always find pretty funny and ironic. So.
Well, I think that's all the questions I have for you. There's a lot that we could have gotten into. Maybe if you stick around a little bit, we can talk a little bit more about Wilson. I read this really interesting book called "Manipulating the Masses."
Okay,
and really thick book. It kind of got tedious, but it went into Wilson's creation of propaganda, and it was fascinating.
Yeah. I know you had sent me, I'm just looking over the questions. I don't know, obviously you run the show, but talking about like greed or anything like that, anything else you want to touch on?
If there's any other thoughts that you have that you want to share, go for it.
Well, I mean, I think, talking about this idea of the corporate propaganda and everything, particularly from a Christian perspective, I always think like, it's not that they're creating the idols. I think they're just identifying idols in our heart, and trying to play on it to get us to buy that new car, that new iPhone or whatever. And so, yes, I fight for the right for businesses to be able to act freely. You mentioned a little bit about the whole massive accumulation of wealth by some, I think always the difference is was it done through a voluntary means, or did somebody use the power of the state to accumulate that? For example, that's why the Bible talks so much about, generally how wealthy people are wrong, because they use manipulation, usually through slaves back in those days, right? And so you were literally using the power of the sword to extract wealth through people, through slaves. Whereas in that free market sense, right, which we've talked about a little bit or hinted at and talked about before, there is a difference between, I get why people are frustrated with, if this is what they think capitalism is what we have today, I'm frustrated too, right? That's literally what I do, is try and fight against it. But it's to get to that true free sense of free market capitalism, true capitalism, which I think isn't necessarily around greed or consumerism. It's about using, resources more efficiently to create value, and through voluntary exchange, right? Which goes back to that Christian ethos that we kind of talked about at the beginning, right? Like, I always give the example, J.K. Rowling is a very wealthy author, and it's because I thought I was better off of spending $20 to read a Harry Potter book, right? We increased income inequality every time I gave her $20. She got $20, but I thought I was better off because I got a book, and so it's always through that voluntary exchange and true free market capitalist sense that I think actually puts, if the closest thing to any kind of check on greed, because it's about providing value to others. So I think that's one thing I thought might be worth mentioning.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to our last conversation, because we got more into that kind of stuff there, and I appreciated how you uncovered, how the system isn't really capitalistic. I thought the great example that you gave there was, and I forget the proper term, but with the medical licenses for like MRI machines and things.
Certificate of needs, yes.
Certificate of needs, yeah, that's it. That was just fascinating to me, because it's like, well, I think there's a lot of injustice, and especially so maybe it's a little bit too different here in Romania, but we go to the doctor and we don't have to pay anything, and we do pay, like you have taxes, like once a year you go in and you pay for health insurance, and I'm sure the state subsidizes it, so it should probably cost me more here in Romania, but I think it's closer in Romania than what it is in the States. Some of the, an IV bag of saline water can be, I don't know, $100, and
right.
It's just insane, and it seems unjust towards especially a certain demographic of the population who can't afford that kind of thing. But when you explain things like certificate of needs, you're like, oh, well, it's not capitalism that really did that. It's the government.
Right.
The government not restraining itself.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, but I mean, just to kind of wrap up, you're right. Influence plays out, or, propaganda plays out in every level. Generally, I think it's better at least coming from a corporate side than a government side. But then even on the corporate side, I think it's because it has the ability to play out in so much of our lives and mislead us, because we essentially allow the government to make so many decisions. So it creates opportunities for big corporations, wealthy individuals to take advantage of the influence and money that they have in order to protect themselves, increase their profits, gain unfavorable advantages, So that's how it often plays out, and I see it all the time.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit ironic to me that a lot of the people who hate corporations and capitalism basically want to give all the power to the biggest corporation that exists.
Exactly. And the only one that can enforce things through the barrel of a gun.
Right. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it.
All right. Have a good night.
All right.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.